And welcome everybody to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Today is Thursday, March 12th already, 2020. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part one, World Trade Center Building 7. This is part two, the Twin Towers explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. Andy Steele, our operations manager, is not with us yet, but he, at this time, would be letting you know how you can ask questions. And you can do that by visiting our website, ae911truth.org/continuing ed. So you can put your questions right there. I won't be able to grab them today, though, but we'll get to them next week when we come back for part three of this series. Andy's help is invaluable and invincible. As you can see, he's interviewed a number of guests over many years on his 9/11 Freefall radio program. And just so you know something about my background, I've been responsible in the San Francisco Bay Area here for the last several years for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. That's about, now 12 years ago. And the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort of AE 9/11 Truth, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the Twin Towers using the material in these courses. So let's get started with the Twin Towers. In terms of the design, some hailed it as the crowning achievement of the international style, others criticizing it as heartless modernism. Right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. Compare that to the beautiful unfolding massing of the Empire State Building, which was the tallest building in the world at the time. Let me go full screen for you here. And, almost full screen. There. And we have, 1,400 foot tall building here. But it's the energy, it's the innovative engineering that is prized as we look back upon and reflect upon history here with incredible array of getting 50,000 occupants in this array of elevators in these 3 tiers to their respective work places. 140,000 visitors a day also, So this was completely unique. These are the largest buildings ever, vertical ones. But it's the structural engineering that was incredibly innovative here, because prior to this, we had a forest of columns, like in the Empire State Building, severely impacting the ability of designers to place their tenants, office spaces in these buildings. What they did at the Twin Towers is push the half the columns to the outside in an exoskeleton with these 3 vertical and 3 horizontal welded in the shop beam and spandrel panels, column and spandrel panels, and then bolting them in place at the site. Inside, we had 47 massive core columns, almost solid steel at the base and at halfway up 2 inches thick, and the lightest at the top. And then between these 2 structures were laid the floor panels with these characterized by these lightweight steel trusses with concrete 4-inch and 8-inch on some of the floors, thick, tying these two structures together basically, and transferring the lateral loads from the inside to the outside, where they were taken up by this Verandil truss. So what developed here is 43,000 square feet per floor. It's an acre in size. Each tower, 3.8 million square feet. The floor spans are what is interesting here, though, with 60 feet on the more open side and 35 feet on the other side. Compare this to that forest of columns that they used to have. So this was an incredible achievement for its time, yet it had drawbacks. Low ceilings comparatively to other high rises, and a march of columns all the way around, impacting the cityscape view below. Compare that to the 80s and 90s, when even more structural innovative engineering allowed these unimpaired views. So some likened this to a jail cell. Also, by the 90s, these buildings became white elephants. They were not prized. They did not have the infrastructure of mechanical, electrical communication systems that were updated. They had asbestos that was stopped in the 70s, midway through construction here. But still, the city of New York was requiring the Port Authority to abate that asbestos. According to federal regulations, it was quite, some said, a $5 billion project. So these were not great investments for Larry Silverstein when he acquired the set of buildings and added them to the building that he had developed, Building 7, all becoming part of the World Trade Center complex under his ownership. So really just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, by the way. Very interesting set of research there for you. But let's go into the story of 9/11 and see how it developed on that day.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So when it was attacked again, he immediately...
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's the official story in a nutshell right there. Very convenient. We're going to test that story. And let's first look and see what happens here. The North Towers hit at 8:46 in the morning by flight AA 911. Ooh, American Airlines Flight 11. Interesting. Collapses an hour and a half later or so. So it was hit 15 stories down. So a lot of people equate the collapse of these buildings because of the airline impact, the massive explosion, all that jet fuel. But even NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, they even acknowledged that most of the jet fuel, 90% of it, burned up outside the building, and the rest of it was gone in 10 minutes. So these are normal office fires after that point, and some damage, which was fairly minor relatively to the columns by the jet planes. The South Tower was hit 30 stories down or so, and it collapses an hour later. So again, jet fuel burns up outside. Most of it's gone in 10 minutes, and we have fairly normal office fires, especially in the South Tower, which was hit in the corner of the building. This depiction is not accurate in terms of if you look at the actual impact and angles of the airplane. So there were investigations, a number of them, starting with volunteers who were handpicked and worked their way right into the next investigation or report. These are not really building failure investigations, as you'll see. The FEMA report, they had $600,000 worth of funding. They did, their efforts were quite hampered, as documented by the New York Times. They didn't have access to the blueprints, the site, adequate access, the public to get photographs and so forth. So they were quite impaired, actually. NIST took over the investigation with the $20 million of funding, finally. And, of course, they're part of the executive branch of the government under the Department of Commerce. So they had a stated conclusion that these buildings came down by jet plane impacts and fires. We're going to challenge that conclusion today. But this theory revolves around incredibly hot fires at the time of the collapse, causing the sagging of these floor trusses that we talked about earlier, which caused the pulling in of these perimeter columns, because, as we'll see, they did pull in. And so, but sagging floor trusses can't pull in these 14-inch square steel tube columns. But in their computer model, nevertheless, they imposed a 5,000-pound lateral load on every one of these column to floor truss connections all the way around the building at once, forcing the building in their computer model to fail. So this is right off the bat grounds for investigation of fraud, not to mention the fact that the fires were severely diminished well prior to the collapse of these buildings, indicated by the thick black smoke, oxygen-starved and cooler fires here. So we have a lot of important things to look at, and we use the scientific method. We've had it in the West for over 100 years or so. So at 8911 Truth, we value that 100 years of history, and because it winnows error from truth, fact from fiction. We have a question. How do the towers come down? Well, we do some background research, make observations. How have other towers come down, for instance? Construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the towers come down. We lay them all out without favoritism, partiality, due to perhaps our financial or political obligations, which might sway our objective opinion. Like, for instance, maybe the jet planes were mostly responsible. Perhaps it was the ensuing fires. Or maybe explosions that were seen and heard by witnesses that are ignored by NIST, as we'll see. Controlled demolition, same thing. All the hypotheses need to be laid out, not relegated to questions that are asked and it finally answered years later, as we'll see. We test those hypotheses with experiments after making predictions. If this were true, that would be true, et cetera, et cetera. Analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. That's extremely important. We don't hide our computer input data, for instance, for these computer models, as we saw NIST did last week in part 1 of this series, claiming that it would jeopardize public opinion if we were to release this information to the architects and engineers who were tasked with ensuring public safety is what I meant, not public opinion. It would jeopardize public safety. Gosh. So if the hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? We go back. We construct another hypothesis that stands a better chance against these predictions, experiments, the analysis, until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated. So let's get started with making some observations. Step 2.5 here, background research. Step 2, what are some of the other forces that have destroyed buildings? Well, fire certainly destroyed a whole number of buildings, not steel frame high rises before 9/11, no. But say in wood frame buildings, this is an organic process. It moves through the building every 20 minutes or so, burning out one area, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. Even NIST acknowledges that fires don't last in any one area for more than 20 minutes in a modern office building. That's all the fuel there is. But in a wood frame building, again, if there was a collapse, it would cause the building to fall over to the path of least resistance. So we certainly might expect that if there was to be a collapse also in a steel frame building. But unfortunately, we don't have any other than these tests that were developed in 1995 by British Steel in Cardington. An 8-story building built out of fireproofed steel frame and non-fireproofed steel frame also. We have both in this case. Let's see what we would expect in the 2,000-degree fire here, as you can see by this massive quantity of kindling that they had to put in here to get these fires way hotter than normal office fire could ever get. Let's see what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently. Of course, Jonathan Barnett, the key author of the FEMA report, which we just discussed, is talking about 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse in a fire for the first time in history. History? Well, we haven't seen these massive fires bring down these buildings. Let's take a look.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. One firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, none of them did. Not even this one, which wasn't fireproofed and which survived a fire. There have been a few low-rise buildings, steel frame, that have collapsed due to fire, like in factories. For instance, with an incredible fuel load, they don't even require them to be fireproof because they just say it's not gonna make it. So there are buildings that have collapsed due to natural causes. In this case, earthquakes. We see the building mangled certainly after the collapse, but its columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So this is extremely important because this is not the type of, as we'll see today, aftermath that we see with the collapse of these 110-story buildings. Now, some buildings exploded and they can, of course, be destroyed, but we have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the explosive chemical reactions. So we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Do we have these features in buildings that are damaged by fires? Not really. We will be looking for them with respect to the Twin Towers. Now, explosives can be harnessed quite effectively, and in buildings, they're called controlled demolitions. This is how we bring down high-rise buildings to date. Most all of them have been brought down like this. They place thousands of shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonate them in a very precise order, removing the structure, allowing the building to fall down as you see. So there are a set of features accomplished here that we're going to be taking a look at. And there's only a handful of companies in the United States that can accomplish this, and fire never has. So what are those features? Well, we have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but doesn't have to be that way. Feature number 2 results in a straight down or nearly straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. And there's alternatives there as well. Feature number 3, that's because we have a patterned removal of column supports. That's how you achieve that. And the ensuing free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure in the building. So feature number 5, that results also in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame, columns and beams dismembered one from another. That's the whole idea. So you can pack them up, load them, they're ready for loading and shipment. Limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Feature number 7, patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. If you have these, you know you have explosions. And broken up concrete floors, of course, or pulverized. You don't want to have to go back into a controlled demolition and use jackhammering to break up those floors. So they're quite broken up and manageable by the explosives for loading and shipment. Feature number 5, explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are called squibs in the demolition industry. They're obviously explosions. And feature number 10, of course, chemical evidence left behind in the aftermath. All of this is a really important proof of controlled demolition. And guess what? Fire doesn't create any of them, let alone all of them. The fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. Why? Well, in steel frame buildings, we the steel conducts that heat away from the source. So the steel member never gets to its 1200, or rarely 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, where it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag, which is the only damage we did see in that study by Cardington Steel. Also, to keep that from happening, we put cementitious fireproofing around our steel members, and 2 hours on the beams and 3 hours on the columns. So that's 6 times more protection in terms of length of fire than they ever need, because remember, there's only 20 or 30 minutes of fire in a given area in a building. It moves on. So this is great protection. And all 3 of the high-rise buildings on 9/11 that collapsed were fire protected. Also, we keep the tenants from bringing in fuel loads more than desks or chairs anyway, and paper. They have to keep that in file cabinets, etc. So automatic fire extinguishing systems keeps any of this from becoming a problem, and they put out those fires right away. Typically, the extinguishing systems in the Twin Towers were said to have been compromised by the impacts of the airplanes. So with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, this can be really help, like government documentation. You don't just bring down buildings, in a day. It takes months of planning and approvals, loading of explosives as well. So there's foreknowledge of the destruction. Typically, we know in advance, and we looked at some of that last week in the case of Building 7, with experts agreeing, hey, that's a controlled demolition, or it looks like one. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building has been taken down or not by controlled demolition. With video documentation too, of course, of which we have plenty, this can be proof of controlled demolition. And we believe it is. So let's launch into it with the Twin Towers. Feature number 1, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet plane impacts? Well, let's look. Here's the North Tower, standing still, and all of a sudden, it's in uniform sudden motion. That quit early. Let's play it again. No jolt or hesitation or impact. And that one did not play all the way through. I'll test that video for you for next time. But look at any of the videos online yourself, and it doesn't look smooth with the over the YouTube as much, especially with the internet connection we have today. But you'll see it's smooth. It doesn't hit when the cold, hard steel below is impacted. Same with the South Tower. It's still, and all of a sudden, there's a smooth descent, a straight down, uniform, through the path of greatest resistance, the 80,000 tons of structural steel beneath the point of jet plane impacts that was cold and hard and intact and should have slowed that down. But it doesn't. As you'll see, it goes faster and faster. Feature number 2, are there patterned explosions, flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Well, the City Fire Commissioner Thomas von Essen recorded 500 of his first responders. And we learned about this not in the public, didn't learn about it until the court ordered the release of this in August of 2005. This is how I personally became involved, because David Ray Griffin was being interviewed by Bonnie Faulkner on KPFA's Guns and Butter program. Bonnie Faulkner's Guns and Butter program. And he's talking about how many? 118 first responders, because their transcripts were put by the New York Times. They do some things well, this one at least. Observing flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena indicative of explosive demolition. What? We didn't see any of this on the final NIST report or any other official report. We felt the ground shake, one of them says. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, with these witnesses, you're going to hear this order of events. The ground's shaking before the tower came down. Listen to these. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. These are professional witnesses, expert witnesses. An explosion appeared at the very top simultaneously from all four sides. Materials shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the fifth floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. What are they talking about? Let's look at the North Tower compared to a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Slowing it down halfway. Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since no fires ever brought down a skyscraper before 9/11. Especially since fire, the official cause of this building, not only hasn't brought down a skyscraper, but explosions are what have brought down all the skyscrapers before 9/11. And yet it was relegated to a set of frequently asked questions, very frequently, posted on this website years later. Probably should have been the first, if not the only serious hypothesis that NIST considered. Do you ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and then you hear pop, pop, pop? When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. What? Pop, pop, pop before the building's coming down? Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then I looked up. It looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building, and then it would just go all the way around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower. Compared to a known controlled demolition on the left, is there any similarity? Enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Slowing it down halfway. Smooth, sudden, near free fall descent. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. A crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors, and then a series of smaller explosions, which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. Another loud earth-shattering blast with a large fireball that blew out more debris. The lower level of the building. Like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. You see any flashes? I said, yes. I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think, at this point still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's listen to these first responders who were all equally ignored by NIST in their final and draft reports.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now waiting to play on all of us. It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, though we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, instead of popping out. It was if they had detonated. Detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses were included in the final report or any of the reports by NIST or FEMA? 0. These are credible witnesses. NIST says, well, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Well, as you'll see from this expert, Mark Loiseau.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
There's a top-down controlled demolition. So you don't have to start. Remember, this is a magic show. We're being asked to equate the collapse of this building due to the jet planes and the ensuing fires. So they're going to start not at the bottom, but at the point of jet plane impacts. NIST says, well, the upper block drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. This is essentially the official story. It's called the column failure theory, which we talked about the initiation of earlier. But there's a law. It's called Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide like this. Which one wins? The stronger Mack truck will destroy the Volkswagen, right? Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen on the Mack truck? No. The lightest, weakest part of a structure cannot possibly destroy the cold, hard, intact steel below. These columns are continuous all the way up the building, 280 of them. And at the top, they're light. They're virtual pyramids of structure here. As we go down, we get about 2 inches thick on these columns, and then as you see here, and then continuing thicker and thicker and thicker until they're virtually solid steel at the bottom. So no, the Volkswagen cannot destroy the Mack truck. And this is disproven, the official theory that NIST uses, given to us by Zdeněk Bezant, Chicago, Northwestern University, in this extremely complex paper that he submitted called the crush down, crush up theory. It was submitted just 2 days after 9/11. And yet, obviously, a lot more than 2 days of work went into it. Let's look at it, because it violates the laws of physics. Formulas are correct, but the input data is falsified. Watch. First of all, it's obfuscated. Even extremely trained engineers can't make sense out of it, although that's been done, as you'll see. Finally, it's been decoded. Second, they completely eliminate an entire story of columns at the point of jet plane impacts. 12-foot high columns vanished, pulled away mathematically, so that the upper part could get a false start, a head start, to create a dynamic load that never existed in the real world on 9/11. Also, he doubles the mass up above, and he decreases the column strength below. So all of this, in addition to ignoring the column reserve strength, they're 3 to 5 times stronger than they need to be. All of this creates a completely rigged system. The energy of the falling mass is 4 times greater. The energy absorption capacity of the structure below is rendered 3 times less capable. It's rigged 12 to 1 in favor of a collapse, at a minimum 12 to 1. So this is seen actually quite easily, because you have Bezant's theory in blue, which is trying to account for the free fall acceleration of the building as measured, right, by David Chandler, who measures it. So he's not too far off there. But in reality, when you account for the massive structure below and the lack of dynamic impact, you might have an initiation of motion, but it's going to stop. It's going to be arrested. It's going to come to a still place because of the incredible structure below. 80,000 tons of cold, hard, intact steel, right? So the Bezant theory has been refuted by engineers, Tony Zambodi and Richard Johns, as well as here by Zudolinsky. And unfortunately, the errors of Bezant are upheld. They won't publish these refutations. Their reason? It's out of scope. Well, how can it be out of scope to publish a paper that correctly refutes the work of another? So there's an ethics case filed with the American Society of Civil Engineers here, and we're awaiting results from that. And the pile driver is basically what it is. Above the point of jet plane impacts, this 15-story section in the North Tower, it's not even existent. So it can't possibly destroy the rest of the building. Watch, you can see it destroying itself in real time, right before your eyes. I'll make it easier for you. Watch. The red line at the bottom. It doesn't move until now. So the upper part's being destroyed all right, just like the Volkswagen would be. The question is really, what's destroying it? And we're coming to that right now. Lower part's destroyed by something else. We'll come to that in a moment. So we do have exterior perimeter columns that are bowing inward, as you can see in this looped video. Again and again, you can see they're bowing in on this corner, on each side of this corner. The question is, what's pulling them in? Well, let's go back to FEMA before NIST took over their investigation and changed it all around. Here's Gene Corlin.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
What? The core columns let go first? NIST said the perimeter columns let go first. How can we make sense of this? Well, watch the antenna drop back to, forward to, back to. That's at least 10 feet right there before the perimeter of this building drops. Well, how can that be? Well, what does the antenna sit on? It sits on the hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? It sits on the core columns. So the core columns must have failed. Then the hat truss fails, of course, up above them. And then the antenna starts to descend. All this before the perimeter columns descend. And then the core columns pull on the perimeter columns as they're descending. That's what must be causing the collapse, the pulling in of the perimeter columns. Something like this animation. What caused the core columns to fail below the point of jet plane impacts? We'll come to that. The upper section is destroyed in just 4 seconds in the North Tower. Watch, just like the first responders say, stop, like a belt wrapping all the way around the building. These clouds of and explosions. And where in any of the photos or the videos do you see a pile driver driving the rest of the building down to the ground? It should be seen there where that red box is, but it's not seen anywhere. And if it were there, would it not have destroyed these 6 to 8 remaining core columns after, as it was crushing them down? This is complete proof in and of itself that something else destroyed this building, i.e. a series of explosions, which would be responsible for making this look like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009 with upward, outward arching streamers, freely flying structural sections, followed by thick white smoke clouds, which we'll get to next week when we get to the extreme heat of this destruction. Does it even look like a gravitational collapse to you? Feature number 3.
One moment.
Hold on. Everybody turn off your cell phones, please. This is a webinar, for crying out loud. She thought she heard her name. Siri, real helpful sometimes. Well, is there a straight down symmetrical progression? Not into the footprint in this case, like we saw with Building 7 in last week's part 1 of this 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. No, a progression outside the footprint. Let's look at it. Here's the South Tower. Now, it starts to lean over. In fact, it's leaning over at 22 degrees. So there's asymmetrical loading from this part that's falling off the building. There's asymmetrical damage from the airplanes to the columns. There's asymmetrical damage from the fires up above, because none of that is a symmetrical process, right? Well, look below. It's complete symmetrical destruction all the way down the face of the building. It's a non sequitur. It makes no sense. A does not equal B. We're told it's an apple, but it's an orange. Look closely. What are we looking at? A gravitational collapse? Well, the collapse is going on 20 stories up above. What's happening here? Hundreds of explosions rapidly expanding down the corner of this building. How fast? Look in this view. On the right side, traveling almost as fast as the freely falling debris. So there's nothing slowing that down, that destructive process. It can only be made with explosives. This building's 200 feet wide, but the destruction is spread over 1,200 to 1,400 foot diameter around each of these buildings, concentrically, destroying the Winter Garden 600 feet away. Outside the perimeter of each of these towers. Well outside. Compare that to the nice, neat, classic implosion of Building 7 into its own footprint, just about. Versus the incredibly explosive, destructive perimeter of steel elements. By the way, if 100,000 tons of this steel framing is distributed outside the footprint, it's not available to crush the building, is it? What crushed the building? Concrete? Floors? We'll come back to that. Hold that in your mind. Think about this. This is extremely important. Feature number 4, are there ejections of building materials? Well, let's look at, not ejections, but explosive ejections. These are called squibs in the controlled demolition industry, documented here by Dylan Avery and the crew at Loose Change. 20, 40, 60 stories down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse are these explosions going off. We're told, oh, these are solid materials ejected. The air puffs of air. But these are not puffs of air. You can see the solids ejecting out of the side here. Look at the South Tower on the left side in this looped video again and again. Dozens of extremely rapid squibs destroying the interior of this building, which is what's responsible then, of course, for its asymmetrical collapse. Or it could have been responsible for a symmetrical collapse too. Basically liquefying the interior structure of the building. Let's go to David Chandler.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
150 miles per hour. These are not air pressure speeds being produced by this falling mass up above, creating air pressure, which has got to come out somewhere, right? That's the official NIST answer to this problem they have of trying to explain these squibs away. If if it were air pressure, that air pressure would build up in these stories and then blow out all the windows if it blew out any of them, right? Not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that appear to be in an engineered pattern. How fast is the building coming down? Well, let's see. On the left, a timer. On the right, an animation. Here's 5 seconds, 6, 9 seconds. In about a dozen seconds, the entire building is destroyed from top to bottom. Both of them. North and South Towers. Let's try to get this explained. Again, physics teacher David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roof line at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roof line as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
Wait a minute. 64% of free fall, meaning it's accelerating straight down through what? 80,000 tons of structural steel that's cold, hard, intact, which should be slowing it down, if not stopping it altogether, if it could ever start. And yet it's accelerating straight down through it. Let's look at it this way. On the right, we have a chunk, 15-story chunk of this building held up by this magical crane, right? Huge crane. And on the left, the same 15-story tall steel frame section equivalent to the World Trade Center North Tower above the point of jet plane impacts. Below it, though, on this side, we're going to put 80,000 tons of structural steel framing and concrete flooring that's 3 to 5 times stronger than it needs to be to support this structure. We're going to let go of the crane all at once. We'll even give it the non-existent 12-foot head start to develop an unfair dynamic impact on the structure below. What do you think is going to happen? This is 7th grade physics, right? On the right, it's going to fall at free fall, as fast as a bowling ball, right? That's called free fall acceleration. Nothing because there's no resistance under it. On the left, we got all this 80,000 tons of resistance. This is 7th grade physics, right? It's going to slow down if it ever gets going. NIST would have us believe that they both basically hit the ground at the same time. Let's look at it another way from Massimo Mazzucco's September 11th, New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But of course they do still apply, and that's why, once again, in the multi-science publishing, this group of dedicated engineers put forth a peer-reviewed paper challenging the official report that was, in this case, accepted and published. So that remains important work. Do we have feature number 6? Total shattering of the structural steel frame. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition, right? Well, the National Fire Protection Association 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, says look for shrapnel effects. This is the guide that's used all over the country, and that NIST actually helped develop. They should have used it themselves, but obviously they didn't, because here we have high order damage characterized by shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished. Debris thrown great distances, as you see in these other photos, with shrapnel effects. The steel frame is completely shattered all the way down to the bottom, and resulting in breaking down of these columns into their original 37.5-foot lengths. Do we have feature number 7? Lateral ejection of structural steel. This is an uncharacteristic feature of controlled demolition, but one nevertheless that the NFPA 921 says also look for. Blast, pressure, wave effects. Heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, like you see flying every direction out of the Twin Towers after the first 4 seconds of this building's collapse. It goes into this phase 2 of its destruction, with steel landing 300 to 600 feet away in every direction. These are freely flying structural steel sections, like you see here, particularly in this case. Whoa, back to, forward to, that's 45 degrees. How does gravity work? Down. What's going on here? Out. It starts out laterally, then gravity takes over, pulling it here, in this case, to 45 degrees before it smashes into building 7. Let's look at the physics of these. And by the way, we'll get to the trailing thick white smoke clouds in next week's part 3 of this series when we get to the extreme heat. But let's listen to David Chandler, physics teacher, first.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
78 miles per hour. Well, altogether, that's enough energy to send a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's that energy coming from? There's thousands of these. It's not available in the gravitational potential of this building, as I'll show you. Because that gravitational potential, we might say to ourselves, gosh, that was consumed in the pulverization of the concrete, because after all, we're missing 110 floors of concrete, and each an acre in size. They're not stacked up at the bottom like pancakes like you expect in a gravitational collapse like on the right here in Mexico. All we see at the bottom of the Twin Towers is a twisted pile of steel, 3-4 stories tall. Where's the concrete? Oh, there it is. Being pulverized in midair. 90,000 tons of concrete in each of these buildings, pulverized to a fine powder before it develops its gravitational potential energy and hits the ground and smashes. It's powdered to 100-micron particles, average, laid like a blanket around lower Manhattan, 4 inches thick. The U.S. Geological Survey finds up to 30% of the dust is powdered concrete. Let's go to the governor of New York.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized, and I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 210-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, by the way, if 90,000 tons of concrete was pulverized and spread over 3 square miles in this blanket of dust, tell me what crushed the building. It wasn't the steel. That's outside the footprint of the building too. Together, this is 3/4 of the weight of this building. It's not there to crush it. What destroyed the building? Well, we did have the survival of one file cabinet, one of probably about 10,000 file cabinets that disappeared. This one survived because it was from an ice cream store, not because of that, but it was found in the basement. What happened to 10,000 filing cabinets? What happened to the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments, a half an inch long, found on the top of this building, the Deutsche Bank building. Well, they didn't come from the people in this plane because that plane sent its ejections out this way. It didn't come from the people in this plane because the people in that plane, those ejections were blocked from hitting the Deutsche Bank building by World Trade Center 2. Let's look at this deeper. So it's not from the people on the planes. Many were from firefighters. What? Yeah. The red triangles indicate firefighters' bone fragments and other body fragments. But they weren't on the scene until after the planes hit the towers, of course. So it wasn't from the people on the planes or the firefighters. From the people on the planes. We have a total of 2,749 victims, but only 300 whole bodies were found. 20,000 pieces of bodies were found altogether. 6,000 small enough to fit into a test tube. Think about that. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, 1,151 victims remain completely unaccounted for. Let's look at the distribution of these body parts. 800 feet away from the tower. And what we're told was a gravitational collapse, which should have trapped those body parts. How can a gravitational collapse be responsible for that? They should have been trapped between these layers of concrete floors that we can't find. Something else is going on here, right? All of this, features 1 through 8 here so far, are direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Especially these fires, diminished at the time of the collapse. What about the testimony of the first responders? We found before that there were 118. Now that's been increased to 156 by the continued excellent research of Dr. Graham McQueen. It came out in 2015. 156 first responders. But there's another witness called the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, 20 miles north of the World Trade Center. Seismic waves were picked up about the time that the towers were hit by the planes. NIST says, well, this is due to the plane impacts. Well, that makes sense, right? Until you start to really look at it. Like the North Tower is a 0.9 magnitude. The South Tower is a 0.7 magnitude. But let's drill into this just a little bit, because the seismic wave occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds. Well, the plane impacts don't occur until 14 seconds later. So how can they be responsible for the seismic event? This is according to the NTSB radar, which is accurate to within 1 second. The 9/11 Commission used the NTSB radar for their report, which was hailed by the official story. But NIST says, we don't think the plane impacted that late. We think it impacted 10 seconds earlier. Well, how do you know that? Well, we looked at the videos. Well, let's say you're right. You're still off by 4 seconds. What are you going to do about that? Oh, we're going to go back to LDEO and get them to move all their data back 3 seconds. What? This was actually done in a privately contracted deal with a report that was never shown to the American people. We don't even know what their reasoning was. Let's go to the second plane impact into the South Tower. A 0.7 magnitude event picked up at 9:02 and 54 seconds. But the plane impacts, again, according to the NTSB radar, accurate within 1 second, used by the 9/11 Commission, says, gosh, the plane impacts 17 seconds later. What's NIST to do to explain this? Well, we looked at the videos, they say, and we found that it occurred 12 seconds earlier than the NTSB radar, which was accurate to within a second. Okay, you're still off by 5 seconds. What are you going to do about that? Well, we got NIST Columbia University to move back their data 3 seconds for this one also, in a privately contracted deal that was not, the report of which was not publicly available. They won't release it. Well, what could explain the collapses? I mean, these seismic events? Well, there's several things. Here's a gentleman who said the whole building seemed to shake, and there was this loud explosion down in the basement. The two arrived at the sea level. They found the machine shop gone. That's 3 levels down. Nothing there but rubble. 50-ton hydraulic press, gone. It blew up. The two made their way to the parking garage, found that too was gone. Don't know what he means by that, but he says the steel and concrete door that weighed 300 pounds wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil lying on the ground. A bomb had gone off in the basement. Wait a minute. I thought the explosions hit up top. Well, let's go to these witnesses, including William Rodriguez, the janitor, who says that the bomb went off down below him, pushing the floor up.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane. And then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
We got to make sense out of this. Did a bomb go off in the building at seconds before the plane hit? That's crazy. Andre Rousseau, let's go to him. Applied geophysics expert, author of 50 published papers on the progressive mechanical wave and geology. He says, well, gosh, let's look at the frequency of the Raleigh waves. They're on the order of only 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. But aircraft impacts produce much higher frequencies, 10 hertz, often up to 100 hertz, an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude. But these frequencies are filtered out by the bandpass filters used by LDEO. They wouldn't even have been able to determine an impact by a plane that far away. It doesn't even allow for the recording of such waves. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz. Interesting. So they're not, he says the actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened even before hitting the ground. So they wouldn't even be picked up if the seismic equipment could detect it, those frequencies of that height. It couldn't even have been picked up. So, okay, let's go to the collapses. Because there were also seismic events occurring at the time of the building collapses. Of course, the official story says, well, these are due to the buildings collapsing. Makes sense, right? But so let's look at it. We have a 2.3 magnitude earthquake, basically, around the time of the second tower collapse, a 2.3 magnitude earthquake. Let's look at this, because the event happens at 10:28 and 31 seconds. Okay, but and the tower starts descending about 9 seconds before that. Okay. But the first debris doesn't even start hitting the ground until 1 second after the event. And the heaviest debris about 4 seconds after that. So it couldn't be responsible for the seismic event. What does NIST do about this? Oh, we go back to LDEO yet again, well after the event, years later, get them to move all their data back 3 seconds. In this privately contracted event, which we can't get the report from. Yet again, the third time. What could be responsible for the seismic event if it's not the planes? Well, look at these very well-defined P wave and S wave, primary and shear waves. They're ignored by Columbia University in their report. You can't ignore extremely well-defined waves like this. Everything else before this is jagged. Gosh, what could explain this? 4 seconds before is the P wave. Well, let's go back to that idea of explosions in the basement and see if there isn't an event that can explain it, such as cameras on tripods that Dr. Graham McQueen researched very carefully, like this one. 6 seconds before the collapse. So we're still, and there's the movement of the ground, and 6 seconds later, after the smoke arises from the top of the building disintegrates. Well, it telescopes downward. Let's look at another camera on top of another tripod, higher up in elevation, looking at the same North Tower. So we see here, I'm not moving the camera or anything for you. This is on YouTube. There's the shake. The whole thing shaked. Then there's the smoke up at the top, and then suddenly the building 10 seconds later falls down. So the difference between these two shakes is about 4 seconds, which could be explosions in greater proximity to the first camera 4 seconds earlier. So Graham McQueen says, gosh, let's look at the South Tower, because we have the seismic event occurring at 9:59 and 04 seconds. The start of the collapse occurs about 5 seconds earlier than that. And as you can imagine, the first debris doesn't even strike the ground until 7 seconds after that. So how can NIST explain that this event is caused by the collapse of this building? Well, they go back a fourth time to Columbia University, get them to move their whole data back 3 seconds yet again, without any report that anybody else has access to. Well, what could explain that? Okay, let's go back and look, Graham McQueen says, at the New York 1 TV camera that's also shaking about 3 seconds prior to the start of the tower's collapse. Interesting. We have New York 1 camera. We'll play it here. And this one's more subtle. Watch. That was the shake. And I think it's 6 seconds later. Let's start this over. Watch very carefully. Look at the horizontal, the vertical building. There's a shake. 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. Looks like 4 or 5 seconds to me before the tower begins its collapse destruction. The official narrative says, of course, this is due to the debris hitting the ground, but hey, remember, the concrete floors and trusses and gypsum board have all been pulverized to the dust, so there's no seismic component from the concrete and the floors. The concrete is the floors. The steel frame is shattered to individual wall units, 4 to 8 tons, that are peppering the ground over a period of 15 seconds. And they don't hit the ground. They hit the top of, most of them, the parking structure, which is huge around this building. And they're equally distributed over the entire superblock, peppering the ground. So they're not going to have any seismic component 20 miles away. And look at these buildings. We have identical buildings with identical type collapses, if we can call it that, destruction. And yet one of the buildings is 1.6 times greater, producing a 1.6 times greater seismic signal than the other. With 2.1 versus 2.3 is 1.6 times greater energy on the logarithmic scale here. So that's almost an order of magnitude greater one of these is producing. That can't be accounted for by the building or its collapse, the buildings or their collapses. Andre Rousseau says identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases on an order of magnitude. Well, all of this seismic evidence is summarized quite well in the Consensus 9/11 work by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin. And in point TT7, why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence. I would recommend you start there. And by the way, if some people say that there should have been a much greater seismic component from the towers if they actually collapsed. Well, they're comparing that to the Seattle Kingdom, which is a 25,000-pound concrete roof, which impacts the ground virtually at once. So you're comparing apples to apples here. Again, the concrete's pulverizing the Twin Towers. The steel's peppering the ground over the top of the parking structure over 15 seconds. It's not a fair comparison whatsoever. So we have many articles you can go to for further research on this important subject. How about the FEMA and NIST reports? We looked at the FEMA report earlier. The NIST report, they had $20 million to get to the bottom of this. They produced 10,000 pages. Their task by Congress was to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed following the initial impacts of the aircraft. But they have their own objective. It's hidden on footnote 13 on page 82. What was their objective? Gosh, the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. You had 10,000 pages and you produce only 1/2 of a page on the events following the collapse initiation, which is what you were tasked to do with the $20 million that Congress appointed you. The actual collapse, remember, explain the collapse. Well, let's look at that half page. Structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb it. Came down essentially in free fall. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. This is not analysis. Structural engineers do this every day for a living, calculate the ability of the cold, hard, intact structure below to resist any kind of an initiation of collapse. It's not, or the collapse itself. Forensic engineers do. It's not. This is pure speculation on the part of NIST. Why did they stop? They stopped, presumably, because had they gone any further, they would have had to have account for all of this overwhelming evidence of explosive demolition, which you've been looking at today, and that we'll be getting to in next week's part 3 of this series. The report should have been titled Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse. They failed, and we called them on it in 2007 when we got started with a request for correction, which you can do under the Data Quality Act with failures and fraudulence on the part of government agencies like this. They write back, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. That's like having your tail between your legs with your hand caught in the cookie jar, not knowing what else to say. They say, well, we found they were asked thousands of times, did you investigate for explosives? They say, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, wait a minute. Why did, then they write back a year later and they finally admit NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. And yet you claimed years earlier that you found no. That's just disingenuous at best, right? What do the experts say? At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion about whether these are controlled demolitions or not. Like William Rice, one of 100 structural engineers signed on to our petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of these towers. The prevailing theory would have us believe, that William Rice says, that each of the twin towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, while crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration. As if the 80,000 tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. That's what we're talking about here. And David Scott, structural engineer. Near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. Can't have it. It's got to slow down. We've looked at this again and again. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All 3 collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. New Mexico tech expert Van Romero. Explosive devices caused the collapse of the towers. Too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with structures. After the airplanes hit the towers, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. But he withdrew this testimony, professional opinion, because his university is predominantly funded by federal agencies, Defense Department contractors, let's put it that way. As did Mathis Levy, who before joining the FEMA team said this.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
And this gentleman, Ronald Hamburger, who prior to joining the FEMA team said, it appeared to me the charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. We saw that bombs were detonated. Apparently somebody told him, oh no, that's bombs didn't get detonated. Mike Taylor, Executive Director, National Association of Demolition Contractors. Collapse of the towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. Mirrored the strategy used by demolition experts. Explosive devices, not just on the lowest floors, but also on several consecutive floors, about a third of the way up the building. It cascaded down like an explosion. Andre Rousseau, expert from France, even if the planes and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles away. And they should have been very similar in two cases to one another. They were not. Controlled demolitions confirmed and demonstrated. Surely the evidence was preserved and protected in easily the most puzzling, mysterious structural failures in history. Let's go to structural engineer from Berkeley, PhD, Abelhausen Astani Azel.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
A little, too late, apparently. The evidence was sent to China for recycling before investigators could properly do a forensic investigation, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions. It's on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And these structures, we have 400 truckloads a day starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, destroying the evidence and the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. So we believe using the scientific method, we come to different conclusions than NIST did, as well as the 9/11 Commission report. What do you think, though? Jet planes, fires, explosions, controlled demolition? What makes the best sense as to the hypothesis? What does the evidence show? 8 key characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition are direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, 3,000 architects and engineers call this proof of controlled demolition. And if you have questions, email them to us by going to the website ae911truth.org and submitting them in our Contact Us form, and we'll get to them next week when Andy comes back. So in the meantime, we encourage you to get informed. Sign the petition at AE911Truth. You don't have to be one of our 3,000 architects and engineers. You could be one of the 20,000 that are supporting them by also signing our petition. And go to the website, ae911truth.org, and do help us out. We're all over the country with presentations. This takes incredible resources, mailings to engineers, the media, the elected representatives. It takes a whole lot of work on the part of our small staff. And you can do that by becoming a member of AE911 Truth also and provide monthly sustaining support. That's how we do what we do. We can't get ahead without you ahead of the curve, and expose 9/11 for what it was. We have to wake the American people up en masse. Obviously, not just design and technical building professionals, but because this is not just about buildings, right? If these are controlled demolitions, this is obviously some sort of a vast problem, an inside operation involving individuals across governmental and non-governmental positions, rogue elements that have achieved a cover-up of enormous magnitude with support from the 5 mainstream media corporations who own and direct all of our mainstream media, 90% of it at least. Who owns those? Who are those boards of directors that run those 5 corporations? They turn out to be the same individuals that run the corporations in the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, all of whom profited enormously and continue to from the events of 9/11. So we have to turn the tide on this. 9/11 truth is the domino that knocks over the other dominoes. It is the big whack on the head with a 2x4, the wake-up call to America. That's why we need you to volunteer with us. We have dozens of volunteers, but we need many, many more. We're doing a whole lot of work with our web team, a writing team, a presenters team, verifications of engineers and architects, translating. We have 22 languages we're now translated into. It just takes an extraordinary amount of work. But you can do this on your own too. Contact your elected representative, send them the AE 9/11 Truth materials, at least the link to our website. Send us stuff to your television, radio, newspapers. Tell everyone you know, every architect and engineer you can find. Screen the DVDs with friends and relatives and architects and engineers. Share the brochures that you can get, for $10, get more than 100 brochures. And take these other action steps on your own, like spreading the final report, which comes out in 2 weeks on the World Trade Center 7 evaluation, which we covered in last week's part 1 of this 3-part series. One of the top forensic structural engineers in the country has completely disproven the NIST report by running a real analysis without fraudulent input data and determining what with regard to Building 7, determining that this building could not have collapsed, as NIST claims, by fire. It had to have been something else. And we talked about what that something else was in great detail last week. I encourage you to pull that out from the YouTube archives from our YouTube channel. Part 1, 9/11 and Architect's Guide. This evidence has gone many times to representatives of Congress, but we need to keep piling it on. So send the material on the Bobby McIlvaine Act to your representative so that we can get a real investigation in Congress. The timing has to be right. It takes a lot of work, but we're going to be ready when that timing hits. And maybe that will be when the grand jury actually meets and reviews the material that we've given them in 60 exhibits, which the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan has promised to comply with the law requiring to give this to a special grand jury. And the lawsuit, when we prevail in our appeal, which we will, the FBI has been sued because they did not provide this material to Congress, which we've been giving you and which we have given them. So we have made a landmark DVD called 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, in which we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence in this incredible series of structural failures. Let's call them what they are. They're massive controlled demolitions. Take a look just for a couple minutes.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fire.
Hey, you can't just
fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red gray crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yes, and you can get see this video, the 1-hour version, for free on YouTube at our channel, YouTube channel, which is AE911 Truth. You can also get the 90-minute version at our store on our website, and that also includes extended versions of these great interviews from these 40 technical building professionals. I encourage you to download the 50-page booklet for free also and take a look at that. It's available in hard copy also for, I don't know, $10 or something. And this 2-hour lecture, which is our classic 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, is available free on YouTube, as is the 15-minute narrated version of this documentary on Building 7, narrated by Ed Asner, made for PBS, a really professionally produced deal, film documentary. So I encourage you to look at that. You can get the DVDs to hand out to people as well. We're without Andy today, so we won't be able to take your questions, but send them in, ae911truth.org. Go to the contact us and write your questions there, and we'll answer them next week. This was part 2 of 9/11 An Architect's Guide today, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction. Now, next week, we're going to go into part 3, the Twin Towers in Extreme Heat, in which we will delve into these high-rise fires, the pyroclastic-like clouds of extreme heat, molten steel and iron everywhere, iron microspheres, the evidence not only of extreme heat, but of thermite and nanothermite. I mean, yes, and nanothermite itself found throughout the World Trade Center dust by an international team of scientists. All that's coming up next week, Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific. And then we start all over again in April with part 1 about Building 7. So I encourage you to stay with us in this series and let us know what you think. Donate to the cause. Like and subscribe to our channel. It will be great help in getting the information out. So do that right now. And until then, we'll see you next week. Bye for now.